Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time when silence was heavy, the air was thick with smoke and fear, and entire cities seemed to hold their breath. A time when the world slowed, not by choice, but by illness. Tonight we'll wander through the narrow cobbled streets of a medieval city struck by the plague, a place where church bells never stopped ringing, where windows stayed shuttered, and where even the wind seemed to whisper warnings. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see this little community stretching quietly across the world, sharing the same moment in time. Now, dim your lights, maybe put on a soft hum of rain, or a fan in the background. Let the day fade away. We're not here for drama or horror, only for quiet remembrance. This is the story of what it was like to live in a medieval plagued city. Let's begin. The morning light fell softly across the city walls, sliding over the stone and timber, as if reluctant to disturb the quiet order of daily life. Long before the first bells began to sound, smoke was already curling from narrow chimneys, carrying with it the familiar scent of damp wood and the faint tang of burning peat. Within these walls the rhythm of existence was slow but certain, drawn out across the hours of the day by ritual, habit, and the unspoken trust that tomorrow would be much the same as today. The streets were narrow, their surfaces uneven with mud and straw, and the traces of yesterday's passing. Merchants lifted the shutters of their stalls, the hinges creaking, revealing baskets of onions, bolts of coarse wool, loaves of bread cooling on wooden boards. A pair of oxen moved lazily down the main thoroughfare, their hooves dull against the stones, drawing a cart piled high with grain sacks. Nearby, a baker's apprentice swept the front step, his face pink from the oven's heat that never truly faded, even through the night. Life was not comfortable, but it was dependable, and for the people of this city, dependability was a kind of peace. By mid-morning, the bells began to toll, not urgently, but with a low, deliberate cadence. They marked time for prayer, for work, for the turning of hours that had no need to be hurried. The sound carried far, echoing between church towers and over the market square, mingling with the murmur of traders and the bleating of animals penned nearby. It was the heartbeat of the place, predictable, steady, endlessly repeating. The people of this city, somewhere in the heart of medieval Europe, were used to discomfort, but not to despair. Famine came and went. Winters were harsh, and childbirth was often a matter of chance rather than medicine. Yet, to most, the world seemed secure in its divine order. The church watched over the living and buried the dead. The guilds tended to the trades. The city gates closed at sundown and opened again at dawn. Beyond the walls lay the countryside, endless fields of rye, wheat and barley, dotted with thatched cottages and the silhouettes of distant monasteries. The average home was a narrow structure of wood and plaster, built close against its neighbors, so that the upper stories leaned slightly inward, nearly touching. Within, the air was cool and close, filled with the smell of smoke, sweat, and old rushes spread across the floors. A small hearth burned constantly, both for warmth and to cook whatever the household could afford. Thick stews of beans and cabbage, occasionally a scrap of meat. In wealthier homes, tapestries hung to ward off drafts. In poorer ones, walls were bare and damp. Yet, in each of them, life followed its appointed path: dawn, labor, meal, rest. In the church, candles flickered beneath painted saints, whose eyes, dulled by candle soot, seemed to gaze down with patient indifference. Latin prayers were murmured by rote, understood by few, but believed by all. Outside, in the graveyard beside the cloister wall, moss covered the stones of those long dead, and sparrows nested between the cracks of the masonry. Death was not a stranger here, only a neighbor, distant yet familiar. Trade bound the city to distant places. Ships came into the port carrying wool from England, spices from the Levant, and silks that had traveled through countless hands since leaving Asia. On the roads, merchants guided mule trains, laden with salt and metal, stopping at inns where the air smelled of ale and horses. News traveled slowly, changing with each retelling, but most who lived here were content to hear that somewhere beyond the horizon, kings quarreled, Crusaders marched, and empires rose and fell, all far removed from their narrow lanes and low ceilings. The rhythm of the week was measured by sound and scent, the clatter of blacksmiths' hammers near the city gate, the sour aroma of tanneries, where hides soaked in pits of lime, the yeasty breath of bakeries rising just before dawn. Evenings brought quieter noises, the muted chatter of neighbors, the soft clink of a mug set down, the whisper of wind in the rafters. These were not romantic lives, but they were certain ones, held together by the small faith that things would remain as they were. In the great hall of the city council, men in heavy robes discussed tariffs, markets, and the upkeep of bridges. In the monasteries beyond the walls, scribes bent over parchment, copying old manuscripts, saints' lives, herbal remedies, fragments of ancient philosophy. The words were dry, their meanings sometimes lost even to those who wrote them. Yet the act of copying was a kind of devotion, a way to preserve order against the encroaching uncertainty of time. Children played in the alleys, chasing one another through puddles, shouting until a mother's call brought them home. Dogs followed carts in hopes of scraps. At the well, women gathered with buckets and gossip, their talk flowing between births, marriages, and the price of flour. There was laughter, even in hardship, and a sense that nothing beyond the walls could truly touch them. The world, after all, had always been hard, but it had always gone on. As evening approached, the light shifted again, golden at first, then slowly fading to a colorless haze. Smoke rose straight into the air, the city settling under a blanket of stillness that only deepened as the curfew bell sounded. Doors were bolted, torches extinguished, and the streets surrendered to darkness. Somewhere, a watchman passed, his footsteps echoing faintly against the stones. Above, the stars appeared, faint through the mist, but constant, marking the same heavens that had watched this place for centuries. There was no sign yet of what was coming. The rats in the grain stores scurried unnoticed. The fleas they carried bit without meaning. The wind blew across the harbour, tugging at the rigging of ships moored at the quay. Beyond the sea, in cities few here could name, something had already begun. A sickness whispered about in letters and rumours, still too distant to matter. The people slept, unaware that the fragile rhythm of their days would soon be broken, not by war or famine, but by something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more patient. And so the night settled, deep and complete. The bells fell silent, the fires burned low, and the city dreamed its ordinary dreams. Dreams of harvest and rain, of saints and salvation, of nothing that would last much longer. By the time the first frost touched the city walls, the talk among merchants had begun to shift. The rhythm of daily life still moved as it always had, bells marking the hours, markets opening and closing with the light. But beneath the surface something faint and uncertain had begun to stir. The traders, those men who travelled beyond the horizon and returned with their carts of salt and bolts of cloth, carried with them stories now, strange whispers from distant coasts where the ports had fallen quiet and the ships had not returned. The stories came slowly, wrapped in rumour and half-belief. A Genoese sailor spoke of a sickness that had crept through the ports of the Black Sea, striking down men so swiftly that they barely had time to confess their sins. A monk passing through from a monastery near the southern trade routes mentioned caravans from the east that had stopped arriving, their paths swallowed by silence. To the people of the city, these tales were like the distant rumble of thunder, audible, unsettling, but too far away to cause fear. The world was large, and the east was impossibly distant. What happened there seldom reached here. Still, the rumours had a texture that clung to memory. They spoke of a pestilence carried by the wind, of entire towns emptied in days, of bodies left unburied, because there were none left to bury them. The words were carried in the low tones of taverns, passed between travellers, reshaped by superstition. In time they reached the ears of the city's elders, the guildmasters, and the clergy. Most dismissed them. Every generation had its tales of divine punishment, of sickness or famine beyond the borders of understanding. The earth was full of such stories, and most of them faded before they reached the next harvest. The merchants who dealt in silk and spice were among the first to notice the shift in the pattern of trade. Ships from the east arrived less frequently, and those that did came light in cargo and heavy in caution. Some captains refused to dock at all, waiting instead in the outer harbour for inspection. Others carried letters sealed with wax, reporting closures of ports along the Black Sea, Kaffa, Tanna, Trebizond, cities that were now whispered to be touched, but to the citizens here, these were names from maps they would never see. The notion of a sickness travelling across continents, invisible yet unstoppable, was unthinkable. Disease, they knew, came from foul air, from bad water, from God's anger, not from men and rats and fleas moving unseen from ship to ship. Still, the city listened, in its way. The physicians, few and uncertain in their learning, began to talk quietly among themselves. They spoke of humours and celestial influences, of Saturn in an unfortunate position, of divine balance upset. In the churches, priests reminded their congregations to pray more earnestly, to fast, to confess. In the marketplace, the butchers joked that the East had always been full of death, but their laughter was uneasy. Somewhere in all these murmurs, a sense of waiting began to grow, subtle but persistent, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Winter came early that year. The winds that blew in from the harbour were cold, and carried with them the brine of distant waters. The ships that arrived brought fewer goods and more questions. Sailors spoke of empty ports, of ships adrift with no one left alive aboard, their cargo spoiling in the hold. Some said it was God's wrath, others, that it was the devil's work. The learned men of the city, the chroniclers and monks, wrote these tales in the margins of their manuscripts, brief notes, uncertain of their truth, yet unwilling to forget them. Life went on. The baker still rose before dawn to light his ovens, the bells still tolled, children still chased one another in the alleys. The world had endured pestilence before, fevers, coughs, sweats that came and went. Each had passed in its own time, leaving behind graves but not ruin. This, they told themselves, would be no different. And yet, when the first ship arrived in the spring, the one that came from the south with its sails stiff and grey with salt, those who watched from the docks noticed something amiss. The sailors did not shout greetings to the shore. The deck was strangely still. When the harbour master climbed aboard, he found only silence and the smell. The ship was burned the next day, its cargo destroyed. The story spread quickly, but so did doubt. A single vessel lost was nothing new. The sea had its dangers, the air its illnesses. It was easier to explain it away than to imagine what might follow. But the smell lingered in memory, a heaviness like spoiled meat, a sweetness that clung to the back of the throat. Those who had gone near it swore the air itself had seemed thicker, the seagulls quieter, and still, the merchants came. Trade could not stop. The city's wealth depended on the movement of ships, the exchange of goods, the pulse of commerce that tied it to the wider world. So they continued to open their gates, to unload their cargoes, to shake hands, to count coins. No one yet thought of isolation. No one yet imagined walls could be too thin, or air too shared. The rumours of sickness remained rumours, faint echoes of something far away, moving westward, closer, though no one could see it coming. Through the spring and into summer, the city began to change in small ways. A nervousness entered its rhythm. Sailors avoided certain inns, merchants refused to touch the hands of strangers. The monks prayed longer in the evening, their chants echoing down the cloisters. And yet, the bells still rang, the fires still burned, and the days passed as they always had, filled with noise and labour, 1,000 small motions of life too ordinary to notice. The city carried on, unaware that the wind which moved through its harbour carried more than the scent of salt and tar. It carried something unseen, patient, waiting. Far beyond the horizon, in ports the merchants once called home, the fires were already burning in the streets. Ships were being set alight, towns abandoned, but such things were too far away to believe. The city slept still in its confidence, its prayers, and its ignorance. The stories had come on the trade wind, but soon the trade itself would follow, bringing with it what the wind only whispered. The harbour always carried its own rhythm, a mingling of sound and scent that marked the pulse of the city. Even in early morning, before the sun had lifted above the horizon, the water lapped gently against the stone quays, and the masts of anchored ships swayed with the slow certainty of tides. The air was heavy with salt, tar, and the faint sweetness of cargo, wine, spices, and grains from far-off lands. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and insistent, though fewer now than before, as if they sensed something in the air that men could not. The first of the spring ships came slowly into view, its sails slack, its hull coated in a pale crust of salt. To the harbour workers, it looked like any other merchant vessel returning from the south. They watched as it drifted closer, the oars rising and falling, cutting the water with measured weariness. There was no celebration at its arrival, but no concern either. Ships often returned in silence after long voyages. Sailors were superstitious men, and the sea left its mark on everyone it carried. When the vessel finally reached the quay, it moved with a sluggishness that unsettled even the most seasoned dockworkers. The ropes were thrown over with less vigor than usual, and when the gangplank dropped, no one came immediately to meet it. After a pause, a single sailor appeared at the rail, thin, pale, moving with the stiffness of one unsteady on his feet. He said little as he tied the moorings. His face turned away. Those on the dock called up to him, asked about the voyage, the markets, the weather in the south. He gave no answers. Later they would remember how quietly the ship had arrived, how little laughter or song had accompanied it. The harbour master approached, his ledger under his arm, noting the ship's name, its origin, its cargo, grain from Sicily, wool, some barrels of oil, the usual goods. The sailors who remained were fewer than should have been aboard for a voyage that long. Some had fallen ill, they said, with fevers that came and went, nothing more than the ague. They crossed themselves when they said it, muttered prayers beneath their breath. The harbour master signed his parchment and waved them on to unload. The city needed the grain, prices had been rising through the winter, and hunger always lurked at the edges of the poorer districts. The cargo was opened, the holds emptied. No one noticed the dark shapes that darted along the ropes, small and quick, vanishing into the cracks between stones. The unloading took 2 days. The crew, weary and coughing, kept mostly to themselves. At night, the taverns nearest the docks were quiet. A few of the sailors slept aboard, rather than spend their coin ashore. Those who did drink kept apart, their voices low, their faces drawn. A few dockworkers said later that the men had smelled of sickness, a sour, metallic scent beneath the salt. But no one paid much attention. The city was accustomed to the odor of sweat, tar, and fish. The human body was always a little unclean. As the holds emptied, the warehouses filled. Sacks of grain were stacked against the damp stone walls, bolts of wool bundled tightly and sealed. The air was thick with dust. In the dim light, rats moved along the rafters, their eyes catching brief glints of torchlight. They were part of the harbour's life, as ordinary as ropes and barrels. No one thought to drive them out. In the taverns men joked about the ship's filth, the vermin they carried, but rats had always been here. It was the price of trade, the background hum of the city's wealth. Within a week, more ships arrived. From Genoa, from Pisa, from the ports of Provence. Each brought cargo and whispers. Some came half-crude, others spoke of sickness in Messina, in Marseille, in the coastal towns of Italy. The harbour masters recorded what they heard, but made no special note of it. Rumour was the sea's second cargo, carried everywhere, believed by no one for long. Yet, there was something different about these sailors, the way they kept to themselves, the way they touched their faces often, as if to hide a cough. Then came the first death, a stevedore who had unloaded grain from one of the ships. He had complained of a swelling beneath his arm, a pain that made it hard to breathe. 2 days later, he was gone. His family buried him quickly. The priests said it was fever from overwork, a natural thing. The city had seen it before, but soon there were others. A woman who lived near the docks fell ill, a boy who swept the warehouse floors, a sailor who never left his berth after arriving. The rumours that had come with the wind now had faces, names, addresses. The physicians were called, though few of them understood what they saw. They examined the swellings, the blackened skin, the high fevers. They spoke of bad air, of imbalance in the humors, of corrupted vapors rising from the sea. They burned incense, bled patients, and instructed the sick to pray. Nothing changed. Still, life continued. Ships continued to dock, trade continued to move. The city, bound by necessity and habit, could not stop. Grain was unloaded by men who crossed themselves before entering the hold, whispering prayers for protection. They said the smell was stronger now, a sweetness that clung to the lungs, followed them home, into their sleep. At night, the harbour was no longer a place of song and laughter. The inns that once rang with the sound of dice and fiddles had fallen silent. The tavern keepers whispered of sailors dying in their rooms, of corpses carried to the shore under moonlight. Some ships left as quickly as they came, their crews restless to escape. Others never left at all. Their decks grew quiet, the sails untended, until the city ordered them emptied, and their cargo taken ashore. More rats followed, slipping into the alleys, spreading through the markets, into homes, into storerooms. The unseen passengers were already at work. By the time the city realized that something had changed, it was too late. The sickness moved faster than thought, slipping between doors, beneath floors, across the very air they breathed. The first to fall were the sailors, then the dock workers, then the women who sold fish near the quay. The harbour, once the city's lifeline, had become its gate of contagion. Still, the bells rang, the priests prayed, and the wind carried the scent of salt and rot inland. The city was not yet afraid, but it was beginning to notice that the familiar noises of the harbour had grown quieter, replaced by the sound of coughing behind closed shutters. And so the ships kept coming, even as others burned. Trade could not stop, survival depended upon it. The sea gave, and it took away. The rats came ashore, and no one saw them go. In the darkness between cargo sacks, they carried the future in their fur, a future that had already claimed the ports of the east, and was now stepping quietly onto these cobbled streets. The wind that had once carried the rumors had done its work. What it whispered had become real, and the city, still half dreaming, began its slow descent into wakefulness, the kind that comes only when fear takes the place of sleep. The mornings that followed seemed ordinary at first. The harbour, though quieter, still breathed its usual rhythm, the slow creak of ships at anchor, the distant toll of the bells from the churches that marked the hours. The merchants came, though fewer now, their cloaks pulled tight against the sea wind. The market opened later, and the laughter that once carried through the square had grown subdued, as though the city itself were speaking in whispers. Yet, to most, life continued much as before. Sickness, after all, was no stranger here. It came and went with the seasons like the fog that rolled in from the sea. The first deaths passed almost unnoticed. A dock worker, strong and accustomed to long labour, fell ill one morning, and could not rise from his bed. His wife said he had been feverish through the night, his breath shallow, his skin hot to the touch. By noon he was gone. They buried him quietly, the priest murmuring the familiar prayers for the soul's repose. The neighbours spoke of overwork, of bad air from the harbour, of the sudden chill that came after a night's rain. Men died often, especially those who worked by the water. The city barely paused to take note. A few days later, the baker's apprentice failed to open the shutters of the shop. The smell of burned bread hung in the street by midday, and when the door was finally forced open, they found him on the floor beside the oven, his skin marked by strange dark blotches along his neck and arms. The baker's wife wept. The priest came, and the body was carried away. It was said he had worked too long in the heat, that his blood had boiled in his veins. People spoke of omens, but in the soft, uncertain tone used when superstition feels uncomfortably close to truth. Elsewhere, others began to fall ill. A merchant's wife near the market square, a tanner's apprentice, an old woman who sold candles outside the church. The city's physicians moved from one patient to another, their long robes gathering the dampness of the air, their faces drawn with fatigue and confusion. They whispered to one another of swellings, of fevers that rose and broke too quickly, of bodies that turned black before breath had fully left them. Yet in their treatises and consultations they could only record what they saw in the language they knew: humoral imbalance, corrupted vapors, divine trial. The priests spoke more urgently now. From the pulpits they warned that the sickness was a punishment for sin, for greed, for vanity, for the corruption of souls that had turned away from God. The people listened, as they always did, with bowed heads and weary hearts. They lit candles and placed them before the icons of the Virgin and the saints. The churchyards grew a little fuller each week, but no one called it plague yet. Plague was a word that belonged to ancient stories, to the time of pharaohs and prophets, not to their own narrow streets and kitchens. By the river, the air had changed. It was thicker now, sour with rot. The fishmongers complained that their catch spoiled faster than before. The butchers began to burn their scraps instead of leaving them for the dogs. The rats were bolder, seen in daylight along the alleys, their bellies round, their fur glossy from the waste of the markets. Children threw stones at them, laughing, unaware of what they carried. The fleas, unseen, went about their quiet business among the straw, the fabric, the folds of clothing. The city's rhythm persisted, but its harmony was slipping. The bells rang more often, funerals now mingling with prayers for rain, for harvest, for protection. The grave diggers, who once worked in the margins of the city's life, began to labor daily. They dug small graves at first, each marked by a simple cross or a stone, names scrawled hastily on wax tablets before being forgotten. It was said that in some quarters, the air smelled faintly of death, though few dared speak it aloud. The mind can ignore what the body already knows, at least for a while. Inside the houses, the sickness spread quietly. Families watched over their own, fearful and uncertain. Those who could afford it sent for the physicians. Those who could not relied on herbs, on prayers, on the laying of hands. Some burned rosemary and sage in their hearths, believing the smoke would drive out the bad air. Others hung charms above their doors, sprigs of juniper, crosses carved into wood, small relics from the church. The belief was not in medicine but in mercy, and mercy was a rare visitor in these days. In the monasteries, the scribes continued their work by candlelight, their pens scratching steadily over parchment. They recorded the deaths as they were reported, the names and causes, the ages and dates. At first the margins of the pages held brief notations: fever, cough, sudden. Then the entries multiplied, the writing more hurried, the ink darker. The monks began to bury their own, the chants in the cloister echoing hollowly through the stone. The city's leaders met in the council hall, debating what to do. Some suggested closing the harbour, others forbade the thought. Trade was the city's lifeblood. Without it, they would starve before the sickness could claim them. The physicians advised the burning of herbs, the carrying of flowers to ward off foul air. No one spoke yet of isolation. The word itself did not exist for them, as it does for us now. They still believed that to turn away the sick was to invite damnation, that to help them was to please God. And so the doors stayed open, and the contagion moved freely, invisible, efficient, inevitable. At night, the sounds of the city began to change. Where once there had been music drifting from taverns and laughter from courtyards, now there was quiet. The coughs carried through thin walls, the sound of shuffling footsteps on the cobblestones, the rattle of a cart bearing a covered shape toward the churchyard. The watchmen still walked their rounds, lanterns swinging, but they moved more quickly now, avoiding the darker corners where the sick lay moaning in their sleep. By summer's end, the deaths could no longer be counted as accidents or exhaustion. There were too many, too sudden. Yet even then, many still refused to see. Denial was a comfort, and fear was an indulgence the poor could not afford. Life demanded its duties: the baking of bread, the mending of nets, the tolling of bells. The city carried on, unaware that the pattern of its days had already been broken beyond repair. Still, there were those who noticed the small things: the way the church bells seemed to ring longer now, the empty stalls in the market, the silence that grew between one funeral and the next. A feeling hung in the air, not panic, but a slow gathering unease, as if the city had begun to sense that something vast and unstoppable was stirring beneath the surface of ordinary life. The sickness was no longer a rumor, or a whisper on the wind. It was here, breathing softly in the dark corners, waiting. The days grew warmer, and with them, the air thickened. It was not just the usual scent of a medieval city, the tang of tallow, the damp musk of livestock, the faint sweetness of grain ground into flour. There was something else now, something heavier, that clung to the breath and the skin. At first it drifted through the streets like a distant smoke, barely noticed, but by midsummer, it became part of the city's rhythm, as inescapable as the sound of the bells. People began to talk about it in hushed tones, as though speaking its presence aloud might give it strength. Housewives, sweeping the thresholds of their homes, noticed that even after scrubbing, the smell of decay seemed to linger, an undercurrent that no amount of vinegar or herbs could drive away. The butchers in the market found their meat spoiling faster than before, even when salted and hung in the shade. The bakers complained that their yeast turned bitter, and near the harbour, where the bodies of the first victims had been buried in haste, the wind brought with it an unmistakable sourness that no one dared to name. The city tried to fight back with fragrance. The priests ordered incense burned almost continuously during Mass, and the thick clouds of frankincense rolled from the church doors into the streets, mingling with the reek of refuse and the breath of the sick. The smoke was meant to purify the air. Miasma, they called it, the invisible corruption that carried illness. People believed the plague travelled through foul vapours, rising from swamps, waste and sin itself, and so the air became a battlefield, rot and sanctity, corruption and devotion, waging a quiet, endless war. Inside the homes, bundles of herbs hung from rafters, rosemary, thyme, sage, lavender, if one could afford it. The wealthy filled their halls with bowls of vinegar, infused with cloves and lemon peel, or carried posies of flowers pressed to their faces. The poorer folk relied on what they had: garlic, onions, smoke from the hearth. The apothecaries sold powders and potions, promising to sweeten the air of the lungs. Yet all the perfumes of the city seemed to fade beneath the growing weight of death's odour. In the narrow streets, the refuse piled faster than it could be carted away, the dung of animals, the waste of households, the debris of abandoned stalls, all of it fermented beneath the summer sun. The carts that once hauled grain now bore bodies, covered in linen, the scent of which no incense could disguise. The grave-diggers sprinkled lime upon the graves, but lime was costly, and soon even that grew scarce. At the edges of the city, smoke rose constantly from pyres, meant to cleanse the air. The council had decreed that old straw, rotted goods, and animal carcasses were to be burned daily. The watchmen enforced it as best they could, though their numbers thinned each week. The fires smouldered day and night, filling the sky with a grey haze that dimmed the sun and stained the stone walls black. To some it seemed as if the city were dissolving slowly into its own smoke, retreating from the world. People adjusted to it, as humans always do. The smell became part of life, another layer of the day. It was there in the bread, in the hair, in the folds of clothing. It clung to the coins that passed from hand to hand. Even the river, once the city's source of freshness, had turned murky and slow, its surface flecked with refuse and ash. Fishermen who ventured near the bridges said that the water no longer smelled of earth and tide, but of sickness, as though it had learned to carry death downstream. The physicians took note of the odor. They described it in their ledgers as the stench of corruption, a symptom of imbalance within the body and the world. Some recommended carrying pomanders, small metal spheres filled with ambergris or musk, to purify one's breath. Others prescribed burning juniper branches in every room. A few wrote of fumigation using sulfur or vinegar vapors, but their remedies were gestures against the inevitable. The air was no longer merely unclean. It was haunted, saturated by the memory of countless exhalations, the mingled breaths of the living and the dying. In the monasteries, the scent entered the cloisters and lingered there despite the stone walls. The monks continued their prayers, their voices steady but tired. The sick came to the gates, seeking blessings and relief, and the brothers tended to them as best they could. The infirmary became a place where air itself seemed thick with fatigue, wax, sweat, and sanctity mixed together into something both holy and unbearable. Some monks began to wear cloths soaked in vinegar across their faces, not for fear but for endurance. They recorded in their chronicles that the air itself grieves, Children were among the few who seemed unbothered. They played still in the courtyards, though fewer now, and their laughter carried strangely in the stillness. They threw stones at rats, chased after dogs, or helped their mothers hang herbs from windowsills. But even their games had changed. Some began to chant new rhymes about sickness, death, and bells, words they could not fully understand, born from the world around them. By late summer, the air had taken on a dull sweetness, the kind that clings to memory. The scent of burning herbs could not mask it, nor could the daily prayers. It seeped into everything: bread, wood, cloth, dreams. Travelers passing through spoke of smelling the city before they could see its gates. To them it was a warning carried on the wind, the invisible herald of the dead. Yet still, people endured. Markets opened, though fewer stalls remained. The baker lit his oven each morning, though his hands trembled. The priests continued their rites. The bells continued their tolls. The scent was no longer an intruder. It had become part of the city's soul, the background hum of a world quietly unraveling. And as autumn began to stir on the horizon, with its cooler breezes and fading leaves, some hoped that the coming chill might wash the air clean. They believed the sickness might fade with the heat, as other fevers had. But the air, heavy and alive with unseen things, carried its secret deeper into the heart of the city, toward those who still breathed it, unaware that every breath was a thread in the same invisible web. As autumn crept over the city, the air cooled, but the heaviness remained. The smoke from the pyres drifted lower now, pressed by the damp sky. It settled between the houses and lingered over the market square, where the shouts of merchants once echoed like music. Now there was quiet, not the peaceful quiet of dawn, but the hollow stillness of absence. The market had always been the city's pulse. Each morning, long before sunrise, carts had arrived from the surrounding countryside, wheels rattling over the cobblestones, their loads covered in linen or straw. There had been the rhythmic calls of the fishmongers, the chatter of women haggling over onions, the laughter of children weaving through the crowds with baskets on their arms. Even when times were hard, when crops failed or war emptied the fields, the market still sang with the noise of living. But that music had faded, replaced by something colder. At first the changes were subtle. A few stalls stood empty, their owners ill or gone. The fish arrived late one morning, the grain carts the next. People blamed the weather, the roads, the harvest. But soon the gaps grew wider. The fruit seller vanished without a word, leaving her baskets overturned in the mud. The blacksmith's apprentice began locking the forge door before noon. The taverns, once full of shouting and song, closed early, or not at all. Fear moved through the market faster than the sickness itself. It lived in glances, the way a hand lingered too long over a coin, the way someone stepped back when another coughed. The people of the city had begun to measure distance not in paces but in breaths. A man might cross the square holding his sleeve to his face, muttering a prayer as he passed. Women no longer touched the fruit before buying it. They pointed instead, and the seller placed it carefully into their baskets with trembling hands. The beggars disappeared first. For years they had been part of the city's scenery. Blind men at the church steps, children with open palms, old women murmuring blessings for scraps of bread. Now their usual places stood empty. Some had taken refuge in the ruins beyond the walls. Others had simply vanished, carried off by the same quiet that was taking everything else. The silence where their voices had been was one of the strangest things of all. By the time the leaves began to fall, the market had changed beyond recognition. The once busy square looked abandoned even at midday. The stalls stood half-covered, their goods sparse, the air heavy with the smell of wilted herbs and spoiled meat. A few merchants still came, those too poor to stay away, but they worked quickly, speaking little, eyes darting toward the church tower where the bells tolled without pause. Every few hours another funeral passed, the sound of footsteps and chants weaving faintly through the still air. The city council issued orders to keep the market open, insisting that life must go on. But life had become a fragile, uncertain thing. Farmers arriving from the countryside found the gates half closed, guards wearing cloths over their faces. Some refused to enter at all, leaving their carts outside the walls for others to retrieve. Within a few weeks the flow of goods began to dry up. Bread grew scarce, then meat, then even salt. The bakers mixed sawdust into their loaves to make them last. Hunger added its voice to the quiet chorus of fear. Inside the taverns that still operated, the wine soured, and the air smelled of smoke and sweat. Patrons sat far apart, speaking in low tones, avoiding one another's eyes. The songs that once filled the night had fallen silent. Musicians no longer played in the corners. Most had left the city, or fallen ill. Those who remained drank not for joy but for forgetting. They said that in the far provinces, the same sickness had begun to spread, carried by traders and pilgrims. It seemed there was nowhere untouched. The market square itself began to decay. The paving stones were slick with rain and ash. The wooden stalls sagged, their cloth awnings torn and darkened with soot. Rats ran openly now, bold and unafraid, darting between baskets and barrels. The city guards no longer chased them. They had other work, collecting bodies or enforcing curfews. Even the bells seemed tired, their tones dull and uneven, as if echoing through an empty shell of what had once been a living world. The friars walked through the square still, their brown robes trailing through the dust. They carried crosses and spoke softly, blessing whoever they met. Sometimes they stopped to help the sick, offering water or prayers. Most people avoided them, not out of disrespect, but fear of being touched. A friar's kindness had become a dangerous gift. Many of them would be dead within the month. At dusk, when the last of the light faded, the market fell into near silence. The fires burned low, the doors closed early, and only the watchmen moved through the square, their footsteps echoing. The city had begun to turn inward. People sealed their windows, prayed behind doors, and listened to the muffled world outside. There were small moments of resistance, quiet acts of persistence. A woman setting out a single basket of apples beside her shuttered home. A child sweeping the steps of a closed shop. The baker lighting his oven, even though no one came. These gestures carried little hope, yet they kept the shape of life intact, as if by habit alone the city refused to vanish completely. But beneath these small rituals, there was a growing recognition, one that no one wanted to speak aloud. The market was not silent because of the dead, but because of the living. People had learned to fear each other. The invisible line between safety and danger ran not through the walls of the city, but between every breath shared. And so the silence grew, not sudden, not total, but gradual, like the dimming of a flame. The city no longer roared with life. It murmured, sighed, and then fell still. The square stood open to the sky, the last leaves of autumn turning in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, the bells rang again. Their sound drifted over the rooftops, soft and steady, marking not hours anymore, but endings. The bells had always been the city's heartbeat, ringing for births, for marriages, for feast days and holy hours. Their sound had once carried joy and order, marking the rhythm of life itself. Now they tolled only for the dead. From morning until long after sunset, the heavy bronze voices echoed over the rooftops, through the narrow alleys, across the silent market square. Their tones, deep and solemn, rolled like waves against the walls, so constant that the people ceased to count how many times they rang in a day. At first there had been ceremony. Each death was still met with ritual, the priest in his vestments, the family gathered close, candles flickering beside the shrouded form. The bells tolled slowly, deliberately, 3 times for a man, twice for a woman, once for a child. Each peal was a farewell, a mark of respect, a gesture toward heaven. But as the weeks passed and the numbers grew, there was no longer time for distinction. The bells tolled without pause, their tones merging into one continuous lament. It became impossible to tell where one funeral ended and the next began. The sound seeped into everything. It lived in the walls, in the stones, in the breath between words. Even in sleep, the city could not escape it. Children dreamed of bells that never stopped ringing. Mothers awoke believing they heard them still, even when silence had fallen for an hour. To live in the city now was to live inside a sound, not loud but endless, like the sea. The bell ringers themselves had grown pale and hollow-eyed. They worked in shifts, climbing the spiral staircases of the church towers, hands blistered from the ropes, ears ringing long after the clappers had stilled. Many were volunteers, men who had lost their trades or their families, and sought purpose in the rhythm of morning. They rarely spoke to one another. The act of ringing had become a kind of penance, a motion without rest, a duty that blurred the line between prayer and exhaustion. In the great cathedral at the heart of the city, the largest bell hung high in the central tower. Its name was Maria, cast a century earlier, its bronze inscribed with prayers for mercy and protection. When it rang, its voice could be heard far beyond the walls, over the fields and rivers. Now, it tolled so often that its tone had begun to change, a slight dullness creeping into the sound as if even metal could grow weary. The people said that the bell was mourning too. The smaller parish churches followed suit. Every quarter had its own tower, and each one rang through the day. Their overlapping tones created a strange dissonance, some deep, some high, all blending into a haunting harmony. The priests said the bells kept the devils away, that their sound purified the air and guided the souls of the dead. But to the people, it became a constant reminder of loss, of fear, of how small their world had become. Children stopped playing near the churches, animals startled at every peal, even the birds seemed to have gone elsewhere, their songs replaced by the clang of metal and the rustle of wind through empty streets. The bells were no longer a call to gather, but a warning to stay apart. The ringers noticed how the city changed beneath them. From their towers they could see rooftops where smoke no longer rose, gardens overgrown, windows boarded. They saw processions of the dead, small groups of figures in hoods, carrying stretchers toward the cemeteries. They saw bonfires burning in the courtyards, where clothes and bedding were set aflame to drive out infection. And always beneath it all, the slow movement of people who no longer hurried, who had accepted the quiet as the only truth left. At night, when the bells paused for a few hours, the silence felt unnatural. The absence of sound was heavier than the ringing itself. Those who lay awake described the stillness as suffocating, a silence so deep it seemed to press against the chest. Some said they could hear the faint echo of bells still, distant and spectral, tolling beyond the city's edge as if the earth itself mourned. There were moments when the bells rang faster, when carts arrived at the church loaded with bodies, when the grave diggers called for prayers before beginning their work. The priests had long since stopped performing individual rites. Instead they stood at the edge of the grave pits, swinging censers of incense, their chants merging with the rhythm of the bells. The smoke rose, mingling with the mist, carrying its scent of resin and ash through the streets. In the smaller parishes, the ropes grew frayed and the wheels worn. Some bells cracked from overuse. When one of them fell silent, the people noticed, not with relief, but dread. Silence now was its own kind of omen. They said that when the bells ceased, it meant there was no one left to ring them. The tolling shaped time itself. Days no longer followed the sun, but the rhythm of funerals. Morning meant the first procession, noon the second, evening the third. The bells marked these transitions with relentless precision. Even those who tried to ignore them found their bodies attuned to the sound. A pause between tolls could make the heart skip. A sudden burst of ringing could pull a person from sleep. The city had become a vast clock, measuring grief. And yet, amid this endless mourning, there was a strange order, a sense that the bells held the world together. Without them, chaos might have swallowed the city whole. Their steady pulse gave form to despair, turning it into something bearable, something structured. The living needed the bells as much as the dead did. They were the city's only remaining language, its only prayer that still reached heaven. Autumn deepened. The days shortened, the air cooled, and the mists thickened over the river. From the towers, the horizon disappeared into grey. The bells tolled through the fog, their sound dampened but enduring, like a heartbeat in the dark. Each note dissolved into the air, into the smoke, into the memory of all the ones that had come before. And when winter finally arrived, bringing with it frost and silence, the bells continued. They tolled for the living as much as for the dead, a sound that said simply that someone still remained to pull the rope. That life, however thin, still persisted. The city listened, half in fear, half in gratitude, to the sound that refused to end. They came first as whispers. Strange processions moving from town to town, barefoot men clothed in rags, chanting hymns in the language of repentance. The bells still tolled in the distance as they arrived, echoing off the empty market walls. By then, the city was already hollowed out, its streets lined with shuttered homes and the smell of ash. When the first of the flagellants appeared at the gate, few dared to come close. They moved in silence, faces gaunt beneath their hoods, carrying crosses and banners painted with the symbols of blood and salvation. From the high windows, people watched. The flagellant's leader walked at the front, barefoot upon the frozen stones, a wooden crucifix hanging from his neck. Behind him trailed dozens of men, some thin and fevered, others young and wild-eyed, their backs already scarred. Each carried a knotted whip, made of leather cords tipped with metal. Every few steps they paused, formed a circle, and began their ritual. They chanted low, rhythmic psalms that rose like smoke in the cold air. Then, without warning, they began to beat themselves. The sound of the lashes was unlike anything the city had ever heard, sharp, wet, relentless. The whips struck flesh and blood sprayed onto the cobblestones. Yet none cried out. They moved in unison, striking their own backs, chanting the same words over and over until voices broke and bodies trembled. The onlookers, half-starved and half-mad from fear, watched with equal parts horror and fascination. Many believed these men carried divine purpose. The priests had grown silent, the physicians powerless, but the flagellants claimed to bring redemption through suffering. They said the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sin, and that only by imitating Christ's pain could mercy be restored. As they marched through the city, their songs echoed against the church walls. Some of the remaining clergy came out to bless them. Others shut the doors tight. The bishop himself forbade them to preach inside the cathedral, but his words carried little weight. People no longer sought the church's comfort. They sought signs of hope, even in madness. Soon the processions drew crowds. Women knelt in the streets as the flagellants passed, pressing rosaries to their lips, begging for intercession. Children followed at a distance, whispering prayers, flinching at every lash. Some men joined the procession, unable to bear the guilt of surviving when so many had died. They stripped their shirts and took up whips, walking beside the others until their backs ran red. Each day the group stopped in the squares to perform the same grim ceremony. They lay face down upon the earth, arms outstretched, while their leader intoned prayers for forgiveness. He named the sins of the world: greed, lust, pride, the arrogance of kings and merchants, and with each word, they struck again. The smell of blood mingled with the incense that still drifted faintly from the churches. When night fell, they did not rest indoors. They slept in cloisters, under bridges, or in the fields beyond the walls. Some said that angels appeared in their dreams, whispering that the end of the pestilence was near. Others said they were haunted by visions of fire and black water, of cities swallowed whole. In the morning, they rose and marched again. Rumors spread that where the flagellants passed, the plague lessened. Desperate towns begged them to visit. But just as often, they brought with them fear and disorder. They accused the rich of greed, the clergy of corruption, the physicians of pride. Sometimes in their frenzy, they broke into monasteries or forced priests to join them. Their faith burned too bright. It consumed everything it touched. The city's authorities tried to keep order. The guards at the gate watched as hundreds entered, chanting and bleeding, leaving crimson trails on the stones. Some officials ordered them to leave, fearing they spread the sickness. But when the crowd gathered to defend them, the guards relented. What use was power when the world was already dying? From the upper windows, the survivors watched the torchlit processions wind through the streets. The songs echoed through the night, a low, mournful rhythm that mingled with the ever-present toll of the bells. The flagellants moved like shadows, their backs gleaming red in the firelight, their eyes fixed heavenward, as if they might bleed their way to paradise. By dawn they were gone. The city awoke to find crimson stains on the cobblestones, bits of torn cloth, and silence once more. For a few days the people whispered that the air felt lighter, the sickness slower. Hope flickered like a dying candle, fragile, brief. But soon the carts began to roll again, bearing the dead to the pits. The bells resumed their toll, and the people began to realize that even the most desperate devotion could not turn away what had already taken root in the heart of the world. Still, their passing left an imprint, a memory that clung like the scent of smoke. The citizens spoke of them in hushed tones, of the men who had bled for everyone, who had cried out for mercy when no one else dared to. Some said they were saints, others said they were fools, but all agreed on one thing: their songs still haunted the streets long after their feet had gone silent. The walls had always been there, stone and certainty, but now they seemed to close tighter with every passing day. Once they were a mark of pride, of belonging, the boundary that defined where the city ended and the wild began. Now they felt like the edge of the world itself. When the council ordered the gates sealed, there were no trumpets or speeches, only the grinding of iron hinges and the sound of wooden beams sliding into place. The city became its own prison, a silent island adrift in a sea of dread. At first it was meant to be temporary, just until the sickness slowed, the mayor said, just until the merchants could be inspected. The clergy prayed, but the disease had already seeped too deep, into the markets, into the wells, into the breath of the people themselves. No one wanted to admit that the walls now held the living and the dying together, locked in slow decay. The guards, once symbols of civic strength, became keepers of despair. They stood atop the ramparts, watching the countryside beyond, where the roads that once bustled with carts and traders now lay empty. Occasionally, travelers appeared on the horizon, desperate figures on foot or horseback, only to turn away when they saw the sealed gates. Some shouted pleas from a distance, begging to enter. Others left small bundles of food or relics at the base of the wall, as if offerings might somehow appease the invisible plague within. From the watchtowers, smoke from distant villages was sometimes visible, curling thinly against the horizon. Rumors drifted in on the wind, that other towns had burned their infected, that some had buried entire streets alive. The people inside the city clung to these tales like driftwood, each one a story of someone suffering more or less than themselves. Trade, the lifeblood of the city, came to a halt. The docks stood silent, their ropes stiff with salt. The warehouses, once full of sacks and spices, became makeshift infirmaries. Ships that tried to dock were turned away, their crews waving white cloths in supplication. No one wanted to risk another contagion. The harbour, once the sound of hammers and shouts, became a cemetery of stillness, the tide lapping at rotting hulls, rats scurrying between abandoned crates. Inside the walls, scarcity began its quiet work. Grain was rationed, water watched carefully, prices rose until coin lost its meaning. Some scavenged among the dead, pulling what could be used: a coat, a loaf of bread, a copper cup, anything left behind by those who no longer needed it. The authorities, frightened yet stubborn, declared quarantines by neighborhood. Wooden barriers went up at the ends of streets, painted with crude signs warning of infection. No one was allowed to cross without a writ. Sometimes the guards obeyed the orders, sometimes they fled. The city fractured into smaller islands within its own walls, each street a small kingdom of fear. At night, the lamplighters no longer made their rounds. Darkness filled the spaces between houses. People moved only by candlelight, their shadows large and wavering on the walls. The bells still rang, though fewer now, their ringers either dead or gone. The great cathedral stood locked, its doors sealed against the sick, who had once sought sanctuary there. The faithful prayed from windows instead, whispering to the sky. Then came the smell of lime and smoke. The authorities began burning infected houses, one by one, to purify the air. The fires burned slowly, sending plumes of ash that drifted like snow over rooftops. Families watched from behind barred windows as their neighbors' homes became pyres. The air grew heavy, the sky dim, and the city's color faded beneath a thin grey haze. The quarantine turned the city inward. Without trade, without news, time itself began to slow. The sun rose and set, but the days blended into each other, a dull rhythm of survival. The few physicians who remained moved like ghosts through the streets, faces wrapped in cloth, carrying small vials of vinegar and herbs. They knocked softly on doors, listened for breath, and marked the dead with chalk. From the outer walls, the sentries reported strange sights at night. Fires flickering in the fields, figures moving along the distant roads, singing faintly in the dark. Some said they were flagellants returning, others said they were the spirits of those denied burial. The guards no longer looked long enough to find out. They kept their torches low and spoke little, afraid that even words might carry the sickness. In the poorest quarters, resignation became the only law. The wells were tainted, the bread stale, the hope thin. People stopped counting the days since the gates closed. Children grew used to the silence, to the smell of burning lime, to the strange quiet that followed every cart that passed by. Occasionally, a raven landed on the parapet, black wings folding neatly as it stared into the city, a small witness to human stillness. Seasons changed with little notice. The trees beyond the walls flowered unseen, then withered again. Inside, the air never felt fresh, always touched by the memory of fever. The wall that once protected had become a reminder of isolation, stone that neither mercy nor plague could pass through, and yet, in its shadow, life continued in small ways. A baker who survived began to bake again, not for profit, but for the neighbors who still breathed. The churchyard, though full, sprouted wildflowers among the graves. Cats prowled the empty streets, sleek and silent, reminders of something untamed that endured beyond the sickness. The city no longer spoke of escape. It had become its own world, contained, suspended, waiting. The walls held more than people now. They held the memory of what was once a living place. And outside, the world turned quietly on, carrying its own burdens of fear and rumor, until one day, the sound of a gate's hinge would creak again, a sound no one dared to hope for, yet all longed to hear. They began to appear like omens, figures in black, walking slowly through the pale, deserted streets. To those who still looked out from their shuttered windows, the sight of the plague physicians brought no comfort. Their long, dark robes, waxed to resist the air, their gloves, their canes, and most of all their masks, all gave them the shape of some half-human creature, neither living nor dead. The curved beaks that jutted from their faces seemed almost to sniff the sickness itself. The physicians did not walk quickly. They moved at the pace of the dying city. Each step was measured, deliberate, the sound of leather on cobblestone echoing faintly between walls. From a distance, they resembled carrion birds, gliding from one house to another, searching for what remained. The masks were filled with herbs and spices, rosemary, mint, camphor, cloves, and vinegar-soaked cloth. It was believed that pleasant scents could ward off the miasma, the poisoned air that was thought to carry the plague. The doctors breathed through their perfumed filters, each inhalation sharp and foreign. They carried wooden canes to examine patients from a distance, to lift sheets, to turn bodies without touch. In a world where even the air was feared, distance was the last defense. They were not doctors as we think of them now. Many had no formal training, only courage, or desperation. A few were scholars, learned in Galen and Hippocrates, who tried to balance the humours of the body, as they'd been taught centuries before. But the plague followed no rules of balance. It was a force without proportion, beyond study. Their books offered no comfort, their instruments no cure. Still they came. Someone had to. They worked under the city's contract, payment promised after the pestilence ended. If the city still existed to pay, most would never collect. The physicians moved from house to house, marking doors with chalk to record the living and the dead. A white cross meant infection, a black mark, death. Over time, the walls became a language of loss, every street a map of disappearance. Inside the homes, the scenes were all the same, silence broken by coughing, a mother lying still beside her child, a man gasping for air, while his family knelt nearby. The physicians leaned over each, careful not to breathe too deeply. They prescribed what they could: vinegar compresses, fumigations, bloodletting, or the burning of herbs. Some burned rosemary in clay pots, letting the smoke drift through rooms like incense. Others carried small brass bells, ringing softly as they moved, both to warn and to bless. No one wanted to be touched by them, yet everyone waited for their knock. Their arrival meant acknowledgement, that someone still saw, still counted the dying. When they left, the silence returned, deeper than before. The chalk mark on the door remained as their only trace. In the mornings, they met in the shadow of the cathedral, comparing notes in low voices. Some spoke of swellings that turned black within hours, of blood that refused to clot, of patients who screamed at the sound of bells. Others confessed to dreams, of drowning in smoke, of walking through streets where every window watched. They prayed briefly, then dispersed again. Each step took them closer to the same end they sought to prevent. There was a ritual to their work, the donning of the robe, the tying of gloves, the sealing of the mask. The beak itself became almost sacred, the barrier between the healer and the invisible. Some filled it with crushed juniper, others with rose petals. One physician, whose notes survived, wrote that he added myrrh and ambergris for strength of the heart and to keep the mind steady in the air of death. As the weeks passed, their numbers dwindled. One by one, the physicians fell ill. Some removed their masks only once, for breath or prayer, and never rose again. Their own bodies were burned with those they had tended. New doctors arrived, drawn by duty or ignorance, repeating the same rituals, the same futile kindnesses. The mask became the city's most recognizable face, a symbol of both hope and helplessness. Children whispered stories about them. Some said the beaked men could smell death before it came. Others believed the masks hid not men, but spirits sent by heaven or hell. When the moon was high and the streets empty, the sight of one passing beneath a lantern made the watchers tremble, for they knew the doctors walked only where death had already been. Still there was order in their presence. The city council issued lists. The physicians recorded the numbers. Each morning, a tally was read at the square, though few still cared to hear it. The figures rose like a tide. By the time the ink dried, they were already out of date. In the quieter corners of the city, some physicians left small acts of mercy, bread on a doorstep, a candle at a window, a blessing murmured for those they could not save. In those moments, they seemed less like doctors, more like priests of a dying world, performing last rites for a civilization unraveling by degrees. When the plague was at its height, their shadows stretched long across the cobblestones, like dark wings. They were the only ones who moved freely, the last semblance of authority in a place where law had crumbled. Yet even they began to vanish. A robe found hanging from a nail, a mask left on a doorstep, the scent of camphor lingering where someone had once stood. Eventually the people stopped looking for them. The chalk faded, the doors rotted. The plague had taken everything it wished, but in the centuries that followed, the image remained, the long-beaked mask, the black robe, the silent procession through the fog. And somewhere within the sealed city, one doctor still walked, unseen, marking the passage of time by the sound of his own slow steps, his breath rasping through a mask filled with fading herbs. The monasteries had always been the city's quiet heart, places where the world moved more slowly, where bells marked the hours, and the soft scrape of quills filled the long stone halls. When the plague came, that rhythm faltered, but did not break. The monks continued their rituals as best they could, though the sound of their chanting grew fainter with each passing week. At dawn they rose from thin straw beds, the chill of the air biting through their woolen habits. The great doors of the cloister creaked open, letting in a sliver of pale light. They gathered in the chapel, voices trembling through the hymns of matins, the air thick with the scent of wax and dust. Outside, the city lay still, its streets veiled in mist. Inside, the monks prayed not for salvation, but for endurance, that their hands would hold steady as they wrote, and their faith remain unbroken. The task of record-keeping had always been sacred work. Each name entered into the monastery's ledger was an offering against oblivion, a way to remember what God's silence might otherwise erase. Now those ledgers filled faster than any hand could write. The scribes sat bent over their desks from dawn until dark, ink running low, their fingers cramped and blackened. They no longer recorded baptisms or marriages, but deaths, long lists of names, many without families left to speak them. The abbot ordered that every parish send word of its losses. Messengers came rarely and often sick themselves, carrying scraps of parchment smudged with hurried ink. Some bore no writing at all, only marks where tears had fallen. The monks copied what they could still read, their quills whispering across the vellum, each stroke another admission that the city was dissolving. Outside the scriptorium, the courtyard was overgrown. The herb garden, once tended daily, lay wild beneath the grey sky. The brothers who had once gathered mint and sage for medicine were gone now, buried in shallow graves behind the chapel. The bell tower no longer rang for meals, only for burials. At first the monks had tried to follow the rites properly. The dead were washed, shrouded, and carried to the cemetery, where prayers were spoken over open earth. But soon there were too many. The graves were dug hastily, sometimes without markers, the soil still damp from the last. The brothers sang what they could, their voices thin and weary. As the days grew longer, and the air thicker, they began to bury by night. Torches flickered between the crosses, the chants drifting through the dark like murmurs in a dream. Inside the cloister, the silence deepened. The sound of chanting from one chapel no longer echoed back from another. The infirmary was full, the beds crowded with those too weak to rise. The monks moved among them, carrying bowls of broth and sprigs of lavender, whispering blessings that went unanswered. When one of their own fell ill, he was tended by the others until he could no longer speak. His habit was removed, washed in vinegar, and placed aside for another brother who would soon need it. The abbot, once a man of stern discipline, began to move more slowly. His voice grew softer, his eyes sunken. Yet he insisted that the prayers continue. Even the silence must be recorded, he said once, and the monks obeyed. They wrote of the empty stalls in the refectory, of the extinguished candles, of the nights when the wind carried the sound of weeping from the city below. They wrote not for others, but for time itself, as if one day the world might need to remember how the end had sounded. Sometimes when the sun fell low, a few of the remaining brothers would gather in the cloister walk. They sat on the cold stone benches and listened to the fountain's trickle, its sound steady despite all else. They spoke little. Words had become too heavy. Instead, they recited psalms under their breath, each line fading before it reached the next. Above them, swallows nested in the rafters, their small lives continuing without fear or faith, as if untouched by the sickness that had undone men. In the library, dust settled on manuscripts no one had opened in months. The books of law and philosophy lay still, their pages curling slightly from the damp. Only the death registers grew, their weight bending the shelves. The ink dried unevenly, where hands had trembled. On some pages, the script grew smaller and smaller, as if to save space, as if the scribe had known that there would be no end to write toward. When the plague reached the monastery fully, the last of the brothers worked in silence. They no longer sang at dawn, but whispered prayers while digging graves. The abbot died in midsummer, his body carried by two surviving monks who could barely lift the weight. They buried him beneath the apple tree by the wall, marking the spot with a single stone. After that, no one kept count. Yet even as the walls of the monastery grew empty, its purpose endured. A lone brother continued to write, his candle flickering as he copied names into the ledger, names sent from parishes that no longer existed, names perhaps imagined, preserved for a future that might never come. Outside, the bells had fallen silent, their ropes hanging loose. Inside, the last monk wrote by instinct, his quill scratching the thin line between memory and forgetting. In that stillness, the monastery became something beyond a place, a vessel for the voices that had vanished. The faint smell of ink lingered, the echo of chants hung in the rafters, and the ledgers, bound and heavy, waited for the centuries that would one day open them again. And so the silence deepened, not empty, but full of everything once spoken. By the time the last echoes of prayer faded from the monastery walls, the city's streets had already begun to surrender to silence. The rhythm of footsteps, once constant and human, was gone. No merchants called from their stalls, No laughter spilled from tavern doors. The markets, once the heart of noise and barter, now stood as hollow shells of themselves, awnings torn, benches overturned, the smell of old grain drifting through the air like a ghost of plenty. Shutters hung crooked from their hinges, swaying faintly in the wind. Doors stood ajar, but no one stepped through them. A cart lay overturned near the square, its wheels half buried in dust, the remnants of spilled apples rotting quietly beside it. The cobblestones, once worn smooth by countless feet, were littered now with straw, ash, and forgotten things. A child's wooden toy, a cracked jug, a shoe without its pair. It had not happened all at once. For weeks the streets had thinned. First the elderly, then the traders, then the children whose laughter had carried between walls. People had closed their shutters not out of fear alone, but out of resignation. Each house became its own island, sealed against the invisible tide that swept the city. And when the tide finally receded, it left only silence behind. The dogs came first. They were thin, cautious, wandering through alleys in search of scraps. Some had once belonged to families now gone. They lingered near familiar doors, whining softly, waiting for voices that would never answer. Others turned feral, forming packs that roamed the markets at night, their eyes catching the faint orange glow of distant torches. When they fought, their snarls carried down the empty lanes, echoing off the stone like distant thunder. Cats too made their kingdom among the ruins. Sleek and silent, they moved along rooftops, slipping through broken windows, indifferent to the death that lingered below. Their cries at night sounded strange, long, hollow, almost human. To the few still alive, they were the city's new inhabitants, the quiet witnesses to a world rearranging itself. The smell of the streets had changed. Once a mix of bread, leather, and sea salt, it had become something else. Smoke, rot, and the faint metallic tang of lime. The fires that burned in courtyards and crossroads were meant to purify the air, but their smoke only deepened the haze that clung to everything. Even the sky seemed to dim, as though it too had grown weary of looking down. In the wealthier districts, time had simply stopped. Curtains still hung in high windows, but behind them there was no movement. Some mansions stood locked from the inside, their owners sealed within. Others had been broken open by looters, stripped bare, and left to crumble. Portraits of forgotten faces looked down from soot-streaked walls, their painted eyes reflecting the emptiness that filled every hall. The fountains, once alive with the laughter of children and the chatter of washerwomen, had gone dry. The city's aqueducts, neglected for months, now carried only air. Moss crept up the sides of the basins, and birds came to drink from the puddles left by the rain. The sound of water, once constant, was now so rare that those who heard it sometimes paused, unsure if it was real or remembered. From the harbour, the smell of the sea reached further inland than before. The ships that had once brought silk, spices, and rumour, now sat anchored in stillness, their masts swaying faintly. Ropes creaked against the docks, and the wind carried the faint sound of gulls calling over an empty quay. In the central square, the great statue of the city's founder stood untouched, though pigeons had made their homes upon his shoulders. His marble gaze, once proud and commanding, seemed now to look upon ruin with quiet bewilderment. The plaques beneath his feet, carved with the achievements of generations, were streaked with grime and ash. Occasionally, a figure would pass through the streets, a survivor moving silently beneath a cloak, eyes averted, steps quick. They did not linger. They avoided looking into doorways, avoided touching anything that might remember the living. Some carried baskets of bread or jugs of water for those still breathing behind bolted doors. Others searched for signs of family, a mark on a door, a scrap of cloth. But most walked alone, as if guided by habit more than hope. The churches, though still standing, were hollow. Their bells hung silent, their pews coated in dust. Candles burned only in a few, small flames trembling in vast spaces meant for hundreds. The priests who remained whispered mass to empty air, their voices echoing against the stone. In some chapels, bodies lay upon the floors, awaiting burial that would not come. Even the birds seemed fewer. Their songs, once bright and chaotic, now came rarely and faintly. The silence was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something else. A deep, unmoving stillness that pressed upon the skin, that made each breath feel like a small defiance. Nightfall came quietly now. There were no curfews, no watchman to call the hour. The city faded into darkness without ceremony. Lamps burned out and were not relit. The moonlight fell across the rooftops, revealing the shapes of forgotten things. A laundry line frozen mid-motion, a cup left on a windowsill, a half-written letter caught beneath the dust. In the outskirts, where the city walls met the fields, reeds began to push through cracks in the stone. Nature, patient and indifferent, was reclaiming what man had built. Grass grew between cobblestones, vines climbed over statues, and the sound of crickets returned to the places where only men had once spoken. And so, the streets remained, not dead, but waiting for feet to return, for doors to open, for laughter to echo again, waiting for something, anything, to stir the dust. But for now, only the wind moved, carrying the faint toll of a distant bell through lanes that no longer had names. Through a city learning how to be empty, the fires began small. At first, they were little more than hearth flames carried into the open squares by those who still clung to superstition and hope. People believed that the smoke could cleanse the air, that the heat might drive out the invisible poison that had settled over the city. By decree or by fear, soon every district was ordered to keep a fire burning day and night, a wall of smoke to guard against death. As the days passed, the flames multiplied. Bonfires rose in the marketplaces, in the courtyards of guild halls, even before the steps of churches. They were fed with anything that would burn: straw, timber, broken carts, old furniture, and the belongings of the dead. Piles of clothing, once worn by neighbors and friends, went crackling into the flames, releasing a sharp, bitter scent. The smoke drifted low through the streets, rolling between the buildings like fog, muting everything it touched. The world took on a strange softness beneath it. Edges blurred, colors dulled. The blue of the sky was swallowed in grey. Even the sunlight seemed weary, reduced to a pale glow behind the haze. The city had become a landscape of silhouettes, figures moving slowly through drifting smoke, shapes without detail or distinction. When the wind changed, the smoke thickened, coating walls and faces with a fine grey film. Breathing became labor. Voices rasped. The sound of coughing echoed everywhere, blending with the low crackle of wood and the distant creak of collapsing beams. There were those who tended the fires as a kind of ritual. Hooded figures appeared at dawn to stir the embers, to add more fuel, to ensure the flames never died. Some were city watchmen, others simply those who needed purpose amid the ruin. They moved methodically, feeding the flames with broken furniture, old barrels, or, at times, the bedding of those already gone. When the smoke grew too thick, they wrapped their faces with damp cloths and kept working. To them, the fire was the last remaining sign of order, the one thing still within human control. The smell was constant. It clung to skin, to hair, to every scrap of cloth, a mixture of burning wood, tallow, and the faint, unmistakable scent of decay. It seeped into homes even through shuttered windows. The citizens had grown used to it, no longer able to tell where the smoke ended and the air began. Even the bread, when baked, carried its taste, a bitter flavor that reminded everyone, with each bite of the fire outside. Some fires were built for darker reasons. In certain corners of the city, pyres were erected not just for purifying the air, but for disposing of the dead. The gravediggers could no longer keep pace, and so the fires became both offering and grave. Cloaked men moved under nightfall, carrying bodies wrapped in rough cloth. They laid them carefully, almost tenderly, upon the flames, crossing themselves before stepping back. The smoke from those pyres was different, heavier, darker, carrying with it the unmistakable sweetness of burnt flesh. People avoided those streets when they could, yet the wind carried reminders everywhere. From the harbour, the sight was haunting. The city appeared as a low, smouldering shape on the horizon, veiled in a crown of drifting smoke. Sailors spoke of it as a warning, a ghost city burning itself to stay alive. The smell reached far out to sea, and travelers knew to anchor elsewhere, steering wide around the cursed shore. Inside the walls, sound itself changed. The normal noises of life, the chatter, the clatter, the laughter, were gone. What remained was the constant sighing of wind through alleys, and the distant, uneven crackle of flame. When the fires roared too high, sparks floated upward and disappeared into the grey, like faint stars in a dead sky. Children's toys, books and letters, all found their way into the flames. What was once cherished was now seen as a danger, a carrier of unseen death. Some families burned everything they owned, believing that to destroy the past was to survive the present. Others did it for reasons more private, to erase the memory of what they had lost, to send it away with the smoke. There were moments when the firelight flickered across walls and created the illusion of movement, shadows swaying like people. Those who saw it sometimes stopped, half expecting someone to step out from the haze, but no one did. The fire gave everything a ghostly animation, as if the city itself were trying to remember how to live. The priests blessed the flames in processions, swinging censers heavy with incense. The mingling scents, incense and ash, faith and fear, became the perfume of survival. They chanted softly as they walked, their words fading into the night as the smoke thickened. Some collapsed mid-prayer, overcome by exhaustion or sickness, their voices swallowed by the same haze that devoured the city. By night, the fires glowed red across the rooftops, a faint pulsing light visible even from the surrounding hills. Travelers said it looked as if the city had sunk beneath an ocean of smoke, its towers rising like the masts of a drowning ship. Within, those still alive moved slowly through the glow, their shadows stretching long on the cobblestones. Even the stars disappeared. For weeks, the sky above the city remained a dull orange-brown, the constellations hidden behind the drifting veil. Time itself began to lose meaning. Day and night blurred together under the constant haze. People measured their hours not by the position of the sun, but by the moments when the fires needed more wood. Eventually the fires became less about hope and more about habit. No one believed they could truly stop the plague anymore, but the city kept burning because it had nothing else to do. The flames had become the rhythm of existence, the last ritual of a civilization trying to hold itself together. And so the smoke continued to rise, day after day, week after week, until it was all that remained of the city's voice. It rolled across rooftops, through open windows, over silent courtyards, and beyond the walls. It mingled with the morning fog and drifted out toward the countryside, where those who watched from afar could see the faint plume and whisper that somewhere beyond the horizon, a city was still burning, still trying to live. Inside the homes that still stood, a strange kind of stillness took hold, not the silence of death, but the pause that comes before decay claims what remains. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of smoke from the fires outside, and the faint sweetness of old bread. Tables sat as they had been left, wooden planks scarred by years of use, set for meals that would never be eaten. A loaf of bread hardened beside a dull knife. Cups of wine, darkened and sticky, stood half-filled, their surfaces filmed over like stagnant pools. The candles beside them had burned low, leaving trails of wax that cooled into pale rivers down their sides. In the wealthier homes, silver goblets glimmered faintly in the dim light that filtered through the shutters. Plates of pewter and tin had gathered a fine dusting of ash from the streets beyond, turning every surface grey. The embroidered tablecloths, once symbols of pride and hospitality, now hung stiff with neglect, their folds untouched for days or weeks. Mice scurried across the tabletops, nibbling at crumbs from meals abandoned in haste. The sound of their tiny claws against wood was one of the few remaining noises within those walls. The kitchens told the same story. Cauldrons still hung over cold hearths, their contents congealed into unrecognizable shapes. Herbs that once perfumed the air with promise had long since wilted, their stems dry and brittle. In the corners, baskets of onions and turnips had begun to rot, their skins collapsing into soft, sour-smelling folds. The hearths themselves were coated in soot. No one came to light the fires anymore. Cooking that most human of rituals had ceased. For the living, appetite had disappeared long before hunger did. The sickness stripped away the desire to eat, and fear did the rest. Food became a strange and distant thing, a memory of comfort, now replaced by the urgency of survival. Even those who remained untouched by the disease could barely bring themselves to chew. Bread hardened faster than it was eaten. The scent of meat was now enough to make one sick, and so kitchens were abandoned, tables left untouched, and meals became relics of a vanished order. In some houses, the table still bore the marks of family life. A child's cup beside a larger one, a piece of embroidery, half finished, folded neatly beside a bowl, the impression of a hand still visible in a thin layer of flour. These small traces carried more weight than words, quiet evidence of what had once been ordinary. The spaces where laughter had lived now seemed to hum faintly with its absence, like an echo too soft to be heard but too deep to forget. In monasteries and communal halls, the refectories were equally empty. The long wooden benches where monks had once gathered for silent meals stood deserted, the serving platters untouched. In the corners, flies gathered on the rims of bowls, still half filled with broth gone sour. The faint smell of decay, mingled with incense drifting from the chapels, the holy and the unholy woven together in the air. Even the rats avoided some tables, as if sensing that what remained was not meant to be disturbed. The emptiness was not confined to the homes of the poor or the wealthy. Across all quarters, from merchant's house to laborer's hut, the same image repeated itself. Food untouched, candles burned to stubs, the marks of hands frozen in the act of living. A sense that time itself had been halted mid-motion. Bread, that should have been broken together now turned to stone in solitude. Outside, through narrow windows, the dull orange glow of the fires painted the walls with shifting shadows. The smoke crept in through cracks and chimneys, blurring the distinction between inside and out. Those who were still alive sometimes sat before these tables, staring at them as if expecting something. A knock at the door, a voice from the stairs, a sign that life might yet return, but no sound came. The silence pressed in so completely that it felt like a living thing. In one corner house near the market square, a baker's tools still lay scattered beside a mound of flour. The air was thick with the ghost of his trade, the faint sweetness of yeast, the dryness of grain. He had left his loaves half-shaped on the board, their dough hardened like stone. The oven behind him had gone cold, its ashes untouched. For weeks afterward, neighbors spoke of smelling burnt bread each evening, as if the city itself still remembered the scent of what once was nourishment. Elsewhere, wine barrels had burst from neglect, their contents seeping across the floors like blood. In some cellars, the air grew sharp with vinegar, a reminder of festivity now turned to waste. The people who remained no longer poured wine in joy but in mourning, a sip for the dead, a small act of remembrance in a city that seemed to have forgotten everything else. In the homes of the clergy, the pattern was no different. Communion bread, dried on the altar, chalices stood untouched beside the gospel books. Even the sacred spaces had adopted the stillness of the world outside. The priests who remained alive could no longer find congregations to feed, nor ears to hear their blessings. The Eucharist, once a ritual of abundance, had become a lonely act. The city's rhythm, eat, work, pray, rest, had been replaced by a single shared motion. Waiting for the sickness to pass, for footsteps to return, for something other than the dull hum of flies and the slow creak of wood expanding in the damp air. All waiting until waiting itself became meaningless. And yet, the empty tables remained, not cleared away, not replaced, simply left as they were, perhaps because no one had the strength to move them, or perhaps because they served as quiet monuments. Each one a small altar to the lives that had sat before them, each one holding a story in the stains and scratches of its wood. When sunlight broke through the haze, it fell upon these surfaces, revealing dust motes dancing above the ghostly remains of daily life, frozen moments in the long stillness of the plague. The city, once so loud with human appetite, had fallen into a kind of fasting, a silence not of choice, but of necessity. The bread hardened, the wine soured, and the candles guttered out, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and memory. In that silence, it became clear that hunger was no longer for food, but for life itself, for warmth, for company, for the simple act of breaking bread with another soul. And beyond the shuttered windows, the fires still burned. Their glow flickered against the walls, casting shifting patterns that looked almost like movement, as if the city, beneath its grief, was still breathing. But inside, the tables stayed untouched, the bread unbroken, the silence unending. In the long twilight of the plague, when even the air seemed to grow tired of moving, the only creatures that still roamed freely through the city's veins were the children and the rats. The two had become inseparable, not out of affection, but out of necessity. Both were small enough to slip through cracks indoors, both hungry enough to eat what others had left behind, and both quiet enough to survive in a world that no longer noticed them. The children had no parents to scold them, no homes to return to, no hands to guide their own. Some had been left behind by families who had fled. Others had watched as sickness carried their parents away one by one. They lingered in the corners of the city where the fires no longer burned, in the narrow alleys where the smell of death was not as sharp. At first they cried, calling for mothers, fathers, brothers, but soon even those cries faded. There was no one left to answer. They learned quickly. Hunger taught them. Silence protected them. They mimicked what they had seen adults do, piecing together fragments of a vanished order. A girl, perhaps 6 or 7, would pretend to sweep a doorstep that no one crossed. A boy might light a candle beside a bowl of stale bread, bowing his head as if giving thanks. They played at being alive, copying rituals they did not understand, but somehow knew were important. In their small gestures lay an echo of the world that had disappeared, a parody of civilization acted out in whispers. The rats watched them with clever, dark eyes. They had multiplied beyond counting. With every day they grew bolder, moving openly through the markets and squares, darting in and out of doorways like shadows with purpose. The children watched the rats, learned from them. They scavenged as the rats did, waiting until nightfall to slip into abandoned homes, to steal crusts of bread, to drink rainwater that had pooled in broken barrels. Some even followed the rats, knowing that where the creatures went, food, or what passed for it, could be found. At times they fought for the same scraps, but there were also moments of uneasy coexistence. A boy tossing a bone toward a cluster of them, watching their sleek bodies ripple in the dim light. A girl sitting quietly while they crept around her bare feet. The line between human and animal grew thin in those days. Both were survivors now. Both had adapted to a city that had forgotten language and law. In the richer districts, where the houses stood sealed and silent, the children sometimes broke in through shutters or cellar doors. They found strange treasures there, mirrors, jewelry, fine clothes, though none of it meant much to them. Some wrapped themselves in silk robes that dragged along the ground, pretending to be lords and ladies dining at invisible tables. Others painted their faces with soot, their laughter faint and strange as they danced in rooms that once echoed with music. It was play, but it was also mourning, the way a child grieves, by imitation rather than understanding. At night, they slept where they could. Some curled in doorways beside one another, for warmth. Others hid in the lofts of barns, or beneath carts overturned in the streets. When it rained, they gathered beneath the stone arches of churches, pressing close together while the water streamed past the steps. Their voices were soft when they spoke, the voices of children learning to whisper in a city that had forgotten speech. They gave names to places that adults had left nameless. A square became the sleeping place, a fountain the water corner, a ruined bakery the warm house. They navigated the ruins with the precision of memory, moving through the same paths the rats had claimed. In their world, survival became a kind of game, though its stakes were measured in hunger and breath. Sometimes they found the dead. They did not scream or run. Death had become as ordinary as stone. They stepped around the bodies or covered them with bits of cloth if they could. A few whispered small prayers they had half heard in church, mismatched words spoken to no one in particular. They had no fear of the dead anymore. The dead had become simply part of the landscape, like walls or doors or the smoke that never lifted. The rats were always near. In the dark, their small feet made soft rustling sounds, a kind of living heartbeat beneath the silence. They moved with purpose, vanishing into drains and crevices, only to reappear elsewhere. The children followed their patterns, learning where food might be found, where danger might lurk. In a strange way, the rats became teachers, guides through the remains of the city. And yet, for all their mimicry, the children never fully became like the rats. They still reached for meaning, even if they did not know why. A boy once placed a small flower, one of the few that had dared to bloom through the cobblestones, beside the hand of a body. Another girl drew crosses on walls with bits of charcoal, though she did not remember what the sign meant. These gestures, instinctive and fragile, were remnants of something deeply human, flickering faintly in the dark. When dawn came, the light was thin and pale, filtered through layers of lingering smoke. The children rose from their hiding places, brushing ash and straw from their clothes. The rats too emerged, their movements synchronized in strange harmony. For a few brief moments, city and creature shared the same rhythm, scurrying, searching, surviving. The plague had erased the boundaries that once defined the world. From the hills beyond the walls, the city looked abandoned, motionless. But within its labyrinth of alleys and cellars, life still twitched faintly in the form of small feet and smaller hands. These were not the heirs of the old city, not yet, but they were what remained of it. In their play, in their scavenging, in their stubborn refusal to vanish, they carried something forward, even if neither they nor the world would ever recognize it. And through it all, the rats remained constant. When the last fire burned low, and the last bell fell silent, it was they who filled the spaces between. The children watched them, and learned their patience, how to live quietly, how to wait. In time, as the smoke thinned and the air grew clearer, it would be the children who emerged from the ruins, blinking in the sunlight, carrying within them the faint, unbroken pulse of survival. Beyond the city walls, where the ground sloped gently toward the fields, the earth had begun to open. What had once been farmland, a patchwork of furrows and fences, was now a landscape of freshly turned soil, the color of dark iron and ash. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. It was there, under the pale light of the moon, or the dull red of torches, that the dead were gathered. At first each body had been carried with care. Families had followed in small processions, candles in hand, reciting prayers as the bells tolled. The priests had walked beside them, their voices low and steady, blessing each soul by name, but the rhythm of death quickened. Names blurred into numbers, the bells rang too often, and the priests could no longer remember who had come before, and who was still to come. The city's graveyards filled, the churchyards overflowed, and the ground itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of the dead. When no space remained, they began to dig beyond the walls. At first one pit, then two, then so many that the fields resembled a map of open wounds. The grave diggers, once a small guild of quiet men, became an army of hollow-eyed laborers. Some were volunteers seeking mercy, others were convicts offered pardon, and some were simply those too poor to refuse the coin. They worked in silence, their spades rising and falling in rhythm, carving long trenches that stretched into the mist. The bodies came by cart. Each morning and night, the wagons creaked through the city gates, their wheels cutting deep into the mud. Sometimes the dead were wrapped in linen, sometimes in nothing at all. A few had tokens placed upon their chests, a rosary, a letter, a ring, but most were simply laid as they were found, still in the clothes of their final hour. The carts halted at the pits, and the bodies were unloaded in bundles, stacked layer upon layer. The gravediggers moved quickly. There was no time to linger. The priests came at first, walking among the trenches, muttering blessings over the heaps of limbs and faces. They sprinkled holy water where they could, though the water often ran out long before the work was done. Soon the priests stopped coming altogether. Some had fallen ill themselves, others simply could no longer bear the sight. The final rites, once sacred and solemn, dissolved into a quiet, necessary motion, the turning of earth, the covering of flesh, the flattening of ground. Silence replaced ritual. The sound of shovels became the new liturgy. The thud of soil falling on bodies was steady, rhythmic, unbroken, a grim heartbeat for the city. The wind carried the faint scent of lime, poured over the trenches to mask the decay. It did little. The smell lingered, rising with the mist at dawn, settling again at dusk. Farmers who once tilled these fields now avoided them altogether. They said the earth had turned restless, that it whispered at night when the wind blew just right. As the days passed, the graves multiplied. What had begun as a temporary measure became a permanent landscape. Wooden markers were placed at first, small crosses carved with dates or initials, but rain and smoke soon erased them. Grass would not grow there. The soil stayed dark, heavy, refusing to heal. In the city, people spoke less of death and more of space. Where to bury, how deep, how far. The act of mourning had become practical, almost bureaucratic. The loss of names, the loss of identity, was an unspoken acceptance. Death had become too vast to individualize. The dead were no longer remembered as fathers or daughters or wives. They were simply the gone, a collective silence beneath the earth. The gravediggers themselves began to change. Their faces grew hollow, their eyes distant. They stopped crossing themselves before lowering the bodies. Words lost meaning when repeated so often before so much loss. Some claimed they could no longer sleep. When they closed their eyes, they saw the trenches, the pale faces, the tangled limbs. A few vanished altogether, perhaps taken by the same sickness, perhaps swallowed by the work itself. When the carts stopped coming for a time, the fields fell silent. Birds would not land there. The torches burned low, and the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint murmur of the city's bells, a sound too soft to comfort, too distant to disturb. The graves, though fresh, already seemed ancient, as if they had always existed beneath the soil, waiting to be uncovered. Those who dared to walk near at night spoke of a strange quiet, a stillness so deep it felt alive. The fires from the city cast a faint glow across the horizon, turning the mist above the fields a dull red. In that half-light, the mounds of earth looked almost like sleeping giants, their outlines softened by fog. It was said that some parents came to the fields in secret, carrying small offerings, a toy, a ribbon, a loaf of bread. They left them at the edge of the pits, whispering the names no one else would speak. Then they turned back toward the city, leaving their grief behind with the earth. No one lingered long. When rain came, the trenches filled with water, and the soil collapsed inward, swallowing what lay beneath. The smell rose again, mingling with the smoke that drifted from the city. For a time the fires and the graves seemed to belong to the same endless ritual, one burning what was still above, the other covering what had fallen below. Eventually the carts began to slow. There were fewer to carry, fewer left to bury. The grave-diggers stood idle by their work, uncertain whether to feel relief or dread. The silence deepened, and the city beyond the walls seemed to draw a slow, ragged breath, not of recovery, but of exhaustion. The pits remained, unmarked and unblessed, open wounds upon the land. In time, grass would grow again, and memory would fade. But for now the earth held them all, the merchants and the beggars, the priests and the thieves, the children and the rats, bound together in one vast grave of silence. And as the wind moved through the fields, carrying with it the distant toll of a final bell, it seemed for a moment that the city itself was breathing a soft prayer, not for the dead, but for what little of the living still remained. And when even prayer could no longer hold back the tide of despair, when the last bell faded into the heavy air, the living began to move, not in the solemn procession of the dead, but in small desperate streams, families clutching what little they owned, travelers without direction, priests abandoning their cloisters, merchants abandoning their ledgers. It began quietly, almost invisibly, a farmer who did not return to market, a candle that did not light in a window, a door left ajar with no one inside. Soon it became an exodus. They left in the grey hours before dawn, when the streets were at their stillest, stepping over the refuse and ash that marked what had once been life. The city that had once thrummed with sound, carts, bells and voices, now echoed only with the shuffle of feet on stone, and the low groan of wagon wheels. Smoke drifted through the narrow lanes, and the air carried the scent of burnt herbs and rot. Those who left did not look back. To turn one's gaze upon the city was to invite madness, to see not one's home, but a tomb made of brick and memory. Some went toward the countryside, believing that fresh air and distance could grant safety. Others fled toward the forests, where the trees might hide them from what they could not see. They followed the old roads, though the milestones meant nothing anymore. Villages that once offered bread and shelter now barred their gates, fearful of strangers carrying unseen death. Travelers were met with silence or stones, driven from one place to the next, like spirits unwelcome in the land of the living. Among them were the remnants of every trade and class. A physician who once wore the beaked mask now travelled barefoot, his satchel empty, his knowledge useless. A mother carried a child who no longer stirred, unable to lay it down. A knight walked without his armor, his sword rusting in its sheath, the symbol of his order now meaningless. Even the wealthy had lost their gilded certainty. Gold could not buy air that did not sicken, nor walls high enough to block the wind. Those who fled together rarely spoke. Words felt fragile, almost sacrilegious, as if sound itself might attract the plague. They learned instead to communicate with glances, a nod toward a stream, a gesture toward a road, a look of warning when they saw another body by the wayside. At night they built small fires, careful to keep them low, afraid of drawing attention. The silence around those flames was profound, broken only by coughing or the faint weeping of someone trying not to be heard. But there were moments, fleeting and strange, when life tried to assert itself again. Children too young to understand death would chase the last surviving fireflies in the dusk. A woman might hum a tune she half remembered, the melody trembling in the smoke. A man would tell a story of the city as it once was, the laughter of markets, the toll of morning bells, and for a moment those gathered around him could almost believe the world still lived. Then the wind would shift, carrying with it the sour scent of decay, and the illusion would break. Behind them, the city decayed into silence. Cats prowled on rooftops where banners once hung. Church doors swung open and shut in the wind. The plague doctors had disappeared, their beaked masks hanging on hooks, the herbs inside them dried to dust. The bells that had once marked every passing hour had fallen still, their ropes cut or rotted through. In the absence of sound, the city began to seem unreal, a memory, or perhaps a warning left for those who might someday return. Yet even outside the walls, there was no true escape. The countryside was not untouched. Villages they passed through were often as empty as the city they had fled. Doors swinging wide, tables still set for meals long since abandoned. Crows gathered in the fields, and the rivers ran slower, clogged with debris. Nature itself seemed uncertain, hesitant to reclaim what humanity had left behind. Still they walked. Some sought monasteries rumored to be untouched by the plague. Others followed stories of distant lands where the air was clean and the sickness unknown. But rumor was as contagious as the disease itself. One man's tale of salvation would lead a dozen others to their deaths. Hope, once the city's rarest commodity, now flickered weakly, feeding only on distance. Along the roads the living began to mark their passage, not with graves but with symbols carved into trees or stones. Crosses, circles, initials, a silent language of survivors. Each mark said, "We were here." But the wind and rain soon wore even these messages away, erasing the traces of those who had fled. By the time the first snow came, the land was nearly empty. Fires no longer glowed at night. Smoke no longer curled from chimneys. The living were scattered, ghosts of themselves moving through fields of frost and fog. They no longer sought safety, only space, only air unshared. And when, after many days, one might stop and look back toward the horizon, there was nothing to see, only a grey line where the city once stood, a place now lost to the living and claimed by silence. The roads that once led to it would soon be overgrown, the bridges broken, the memories softened into story. But even as the last of the travelers vanished into the wilderness, the city did not truly sleep. Beneath the stillness, beneath the ash and the silence, something, memory, guilt, the echo of prayer, remained. waiting. The wind had been gone for so long that when it returned, no one was there to notice. It came quietly, a wandering breath that moved through the hollow streets of the dead city, curling around corners, stirring the remnants of what once was. It lifted the edges of rotted banners that still clung to the church spires, traced its invisible fingers across shutters long since closed, and whispered through the cracks in doors that would never again open from within. There was no sound to compete with it now. No bells, no merchants, no voices, only the wind filling the silence that the plague had left behind. It carried with it the faint smell of the sea, salt and decay mingled into something that might once have been freshness. In some places the wind brushed against parchment, scattering old notes and letters, reminders of human hands that had once written with purpose. In others, it rustled through piles of straw and refuse, stirring the dust of bones ground fine by time. Weeks had passed, or perhaps months. There was no one left to count the days. The sun rose and fell behind layers of smoke and mist, and the city changed slowly beneath its indifference. Roofs caved under the weight of neglect. Ivy began its slow crawl up stone walls. Rats, having fed and multiplied, now ventured boldly through open spaces, ruling the streets that once had belonged to men. Cats watched them from windowsills, thin and quiet, too weary to hunt. The wind moved through the market square where tables stood bleached by weather and abandonment. A few coins, tarnished and forgotten, lay scattered among broken pottery. A child's shoe rested near a well, its leather hardened by dust. The fountain, once a place of laughter and gossip, was dry now. The stone basin cracked. The wind dipped into it briefly, swirling the fallen leaves that had gathered there, then rose again, climbing toward the narrow alleys where the air had once been thick with the scent of bread and life. In the monastery, where chants had once echoed through the cloisters, the wind wandered in as if curious. The candles were long extinguished, their wax melted into uneven pools. A single Bible lay open on a wooden table. Its pages warped with damp, the ink had faded, but the words were still legible. Psalms of lamentation, prayers for deliverance that had never come. The wind turned the page gently, as though reading, and then moved on, out into the garden where weeds had overtaken the graves. Across the city, doors hung loosely on their hinges, creaking faintly as the wind passed through. Curtains, once bright with dye, fluttered in windows where there were no eyes left to see them. The wind carried with it small things, a scrap of parchment, a feather, a lock of hair, fragments of lives unburied. Somewhere, a wooden sign creaked, the name of the tavern it once advertised long forgotten. In its motion there was rhythm, almost like breath, as if the city itself exhaled after a long silence. Outside the walls, the fields that had once fed the city had gone wild. Wheat had grown tall and golden before falling to rot. Vines tangled through hedges, and the earth smelled rich and damp. The wind bent the grasses, tracing ripples through the landscape, and carried the faint echo of something that might have been music. Not real, not present, but remembered by the stones and the soil. Even nature, it seemed, remembered what it had replaced. Far along the road that led to the harbour, ships still sat tethered, their sails in tatters, their masts creaking like old bones. The wind moved through them, rattling loose ropes and rigging, whistling softly through the empty hulls. It stirred the waters gently, enough to rock the vessels in their still moorings. In one, a flag half-eaten by salt fluttered weakly, the last emblem of a world now ended. And still the wind returned, day after day, circling through the same paths, stirring the same dust. It became the city's only inhabitant, the keeper of its ruins, the custodian of its silence. It moved through the rooms of the dead, brushed across tables where bread had hardened, and lifted strands of hair from long collapsed beds. Each gust seemed to remember a sound, a mother calling, a bell ringing, a child laughing, and for a moment those echoes lived again, before dissolving into the stillness. Time lost meaning. The city did not decay all at once. Some houses stood firm, their doors barred from within. Others collapsed in slow surrender, beams giving way to rot. Grass grew in the cracks between cobblestones. Birds returned, first the crows, then the sparrows, their calls startling in the emptiness. They nested in eaves and towers, bringing small bursts of motion back to the silent world. As the wind moved on, it gathered the scent of new growth from beyond the walls. The fields were greening again, wildflowers pushing through soil untouched by plough or foot. Nature had begun its slow reclamation, indifferent, yet patient. Trees along the river bent their branches low, their leaves whispering together as the wind passed through them. It was a soft sound, the kind that might have lulled the living to sleep once. Now it was a requiem, a hymn without words. There were no human witnesses to this renewal. The plague had not only taken life but erased the idea of witness itself. Yet, in the absence of people, the city endured, not as memory, not as ruin, but simply as matter, as place. The wind, in its endless wandering, became the only voice left to speak of it, and through that voice, something persisted. Not grief exactly, but a kind of strange, suspended peace. As spring returned, the air grew lighter, the smoke that had hung over the rooftops for months thinned, and sunlight began to filter through, illuminating motes of dust that drifted like ash. The wind carried them upward, scattering them into brightness, as though returning what had been lost to the sky. And somewhere, beyond the hills and the forests, where the plague had not reached, travellers began to whisper again of the city by the water, the one where the bells had once rung without ceasing, and where now only the wind replied. When the gates finally opened, they did not swing with ceremony or triumph. They simply creaked, slow and uncertain, their hinges stiff from months of disuse. The chains that had sealed them against the world clattered to the ground, dull with rust, and a faint cloud of dust rose into the air. For a long while, nothing happened. The gates stood ajar, the world outside, and the world within staring at one another in quiet disbelief. Then, as though the city itself drew its first hesitant breath, movement began. It was not a crowd that entered, but a trickle, a handful of figures wrapped in coarse cloaks, their faces hidden, their steps careful. They paused just inside the threshold, looking about as though they expected the air itself to be poisonous. They were merchants, mostly, the kind who lived by risk and rumour, drawn by whispers that the pestilence had passed, that the city's silence now meant safety. Behind them came others, farmers from the countryside, wanderers who had fled months before, even a few who had never truly left but had hidden themselves away in cellars or attics, waiting for the bells to stop. The light struck their faces harshly after so much shadow. The streets were unfamiliar now, grown strange in their absence. Weeds pushed up through the cobblestones, doors hung open or were missing entirely. Windows were dark, their glass broken or clouded with dust. The smell was the first thing they noticed, not the sharp rot of death that had once filled the air, but the heavy stillness of decay long settled. The city had stopped breathing, and now, under the pale sun, it seemed to be waiting to decide whether it wished to live again. They moved slowly through the main square, where once there had been noise and barter and song. Their footsteps echoed in the emptiness, each sound startling in its clarity. A stall still stood upright, its canopy long since shredded by wind, its surface littered with the bones of rats and the remnants of coins. A faded sign above a tavern door read a name that no one alive could remember. From an open window, a curtain stirred, the wind's ghostly mimicry of life. For days, they wandered and looked. They did not speak much, for words felt fragile here. They looked for signs of others, calling softly into courtyards, knocking on doors before daring to enter. In one house, they found a table still set for a meal, plates untouched, the bread turned to stone. In another, a cradle beside a cold hearth, its occupant long gone. In the church, they found the pews covered in dust, a layer so thick that their footprints seemed to mar something sacred. The altar candles had melted into strange shapes, wax flowing like frozen rivers. A single bird nested in the rafters, chirping softly in the echoing space. As more days passed, others began to come. A mason and his sons returning to their workshop, a widow with a bundle of herbs, seeking to cleanse what she could. a boy who claimed to have been the only one left in his street, though he could not remember how long he had been alone. They came cautiously, like animals testing the ground after a flood, unsure if the danger was truly gone. They spoke little of the plague itself. The memory of it hung too close, too sharp. Instead, they spoke of practical things: roofs to mend, wells to clean, food to find. Slowly, a strange rhythm began to return. Smoke rose from a few chimneys once again. The sound of hammers echoed faintly as doors were rehung, walls patched. The marketplace, though still empty, began to gather signs of movement. A cart here, a stray chicken there. The city did not awaken all at once. It stirred, then faltered, then stirred again. Every act of rebuilding felt like a question, a quiet test of whether the world still allowed such things. There were moments of almost unbearable stillness. At dusk, when the light caught the edges of broken rooftops, it seemed as if the city itself watched them, uncertain of what to make of these survivors who dared to return. Sometimes the wind would rise suddenly, sweeping through the streets, lifting dust into small whirls that danced briefly and then vanished. The people would pause, look up, and wait for it to pass. They had learned to respect silence, to fear what might be carried on it. And yet, amidst the fear, small acts of life took root. A woman scrubbed the steps of her house until the stones showed beneath the grime. A man cleared weeds from a courtyard and planted beans. A bell ringer, one of the few who had survived, climbed the church tower and with trembling hands tested the rope. The sound that followed was thin, cracked, uncertain, but it carried through the air nonetheless. Some wept when they heard it. Others simply stood, eyes closed, listening as though it might bless them. The merchants, true to their nature, began to trade again. At first it was bartering, cloth for grain, tools for oil. Then as weeks passed, the first wagons arrived from neighboring towns, hesitant, their drivers wary of the place that had once been Death's stronghold. The city, still scarred and hollow, began to breathe in small, uncertain gasps. But the return of life did not erase what had been. Beneath the surface of every sound, every motion, lingered the memory of the stillness that had come before. The people avoided certain streets, certain houses. They buried the dead again, properly this time, marking graves with stones and prayers, whispered too softly to be heard. They painted over the chalk marks left by plague doctors, though sometimes, in certain light, the faint outlines remained. As the months passed, grass gave way to swept stones. The markets reopened, though quieter now, their noise tempered by something like reverence. Children began to play again, but their laughter sounded fragile, like glass that might break at any moment. At night, candles glowed behind windows once more, and from the harbour, the masts of ships swayed gently in the wind, their sails patched, their hulls scrubbed clean. The city lived again, though it was no longer the same. It had learned something it could never unlearn: the weight of silence, the fragility of breath. The survivors did not speak of it openly, but they carried it in the way they moved, the way they looked at one another. They had returned, yes, but part of them had never left the stillness that had claimed so many. And so the gates stood open once more, not as symbols of triumph but of endurance, an invitation and a warning both. Beyond them, the world waited, uncertain but alive, as the wind passed through again, gentle now, carrying not the scent of death, but the faint, hesitant promise of spring. When the survivors began to count, they did so not out of curiosity, but out of duty. The act was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial, an inventory of absence. In the early weeks after the reopening of the gates, no one had wanted to name the dead. It was too soon, the memories too raw. But as the days stretched into months, and the rhythm of life faltered toward something like normal, the city understood that it could not begin again without first acknowledging who was gone. So they began with the ledgers. The monks, those who had survived or returned to the monastery, unrolled the scrolls that had lain untouched since the bells last tolled. Their ink was faded, their pages warped, but the lists were still legible, names written in careful hands, sometimes crossed out, sometimes trailed by short, desperate notes. Fever, gone to the countryside. No word since Michaelmas. The scribes sat in the cold refectory, their pens scratching faintly, filling in gaps as best they could. They did not write in order of importance or station. The plague had made all ranks equal. Instead, they wrote by neighborhood, by street, by house, until the names filled the pages like a roll call of ghosts. In the town square, a similar task began in the open air. A small group of officials, merchants, widows, surviving guild members, gathered each morning at a table, brought from the Hall of Records. They called out names, and those who remained would step forward, sometimes with trembling hands, sometimes with silence. Each answer was a story in itself. A husband's name followed by no, a child's by unknown. When the list was finished for the day, they folded the parchment, sealed it with wax, and placed it with the others in a wooden chest that once held coins. By the time autumn came, that chest was full. The counting spread beyond the city center. In homes where families had once been many, a single person now stood to represent them all. Some marked their losses, not with words but with small tokens. A ribbon tied to a gatepost, a candle left burning in an empty window. Others carved initials into door frames, creating a new kind of census, one written directly into the skin of the city. As the scope of the loss became clearer, something like quiet disbelief settled over the survivors. Streets that had once teemed with hundreds now housed only a handful. Entire guilds had vanished. Trades that had been passed down for generations ended with one unlucky breath. In the parish near the docks, 3 of every 4 names were gone. The church bells, though repaired, rang less often, not from mourning this time, but because there were fewer hands to pull the ropes. The city's geography seemed to have changed along with its population. Space felt different, too wide, too open. The markets, even when full of goods again, carried an echo that could not be filled. Houses stood empty between those re-inhabited, like missing teeth in a half-healed wound. Travelers passing through spoke of how quiet it felt, how the footsteps of a single person seemed to travel farther than sound should. In this quiet, memory began to take root. People told stories to one another in the evenings, not of heroism or survival, but of ordinary things that now seemed miraculous. A baker who had once sung while kneading dough, a child who had fed pigeons by the fountain, a physician who had never refused a call. These recollections spread through the streets like gentle echoes, giving shape to those who were gone, as if saying their names could rebuild something that time had already claimed. The city council, when it finally met again, decided to create an official record, a book, they said, not merely of the dead but of the living as well, so that future generations might know both what was lost and what endured. The pages were bound in rough leather, the script simple and unadorned. They called it the Book of the Counted. It contained, on its first pages, a note: "This city, though diminished, remains. Still, not every name could be found. Too many had died unseen, unrecorded, their bodies burned or buried without mark." In one neighborhood, the survivors painted a mural on the side of a crumbling wall, a field of small white crosses, each for someone remembered, each for someone not. In time, moss grew over the paint, blurring the edges until they looked like stars fading into dusk. The act of counting changed those who did it. It made grief visible, measurable, though never fully understood. It reminded them of what it meant to belong to something, even a broken city, even a world that had proven fragile. The counting gave them back a sense of boundary, of meaning. To know how many were lost was also, in a way, to know how many still lived. As the final pages were filled, the monks carried the records to the cathedral. There, beneath the vaulted ceilings, they placed the book upon the altar. No ceremony followed, no speech or blessing. The silence itself felt sacred enough. Outside, the wind shifted through the narrow streets, carrying the faint toll of a single bell, not for death this time, but for remembrance. The city did not weep. It had already done that, long ago. Now it stood still, smaller but steadier, aware of the weight it carried. Every step on its stones, every voice that rose again within its walls, was an act of defiance against forgetting. The living went on counting in their own ways, in memories, in stories, in the spaces left between. And when the light fell through the stained glass of the rebuilt church, scattering color across the cold floor, it was as if the city itself were counting too, measuring the distance between what had been lost and what remained, holding both with equal care. Years passed, and the city lived again, not in triumph, nor in the blinding rush of renewal, but in the slow rhythm of ordinary life returning, step by step, voice by voice, breath by breath. The plague became something distant, softened by time and retelling, though its shadow never fully faded. The people spoke of it quietly, often only when the wind carried a certain chill, or when the church bells rang a little too long. They called it the time of the pestilence, a phrase that drifted through conversation like a ghost, familiar, cautionary, yet somehow unreal. Children were born who had never known the stillness. They ran through the streets that had once been silent, played in the squares that had held pyres, and splashed their hands in fountains once dry with dust. To them, the city's scars were simply part of its shape: the crumbled wall near the monastery, the patched stone on the cathedral steps, the narrow lane that no one walked after dark. Their parents did not always explain these things. Some silences were deliberate. The living had learned that not every memory needed words, yet memory persisted, not as pain but as texture. It was in the way candles were lit each evening before dusk, an unspoken ritual of gratitude, in the way the markets closed earlier, as if the city itself preferred not to tempt the night. In the faint weariness behind the laughter of those old enough to remember the smoke and the bells, the plague had left them cautious, but it had also made them reverent, for air, for bread, for the fragile pulse of life continuing despite everything. Over the years the stories began to change, the details blurred, the fear diluted by repetition. Some said the sickness had been sent by heaven, others that it had come from the sea. A few who had read the records in the monastery tried to keep the truth precise: the rats, the fleas, the ships at the harbour, but their voices were soft against the comfort of myth. History, like the city, rebuilt itself from what remained. The young listened with wide eyes, but to them it sounded like legend, as distant as the tales of saints and emperors. The stones, however, remembered differently. Beneath their worn surfaces lay the faint memory of footsteps that had never returned, of carts creaking through smoke, of bells tolling until the ropes frayed. The wind, when it swept through the narrow alleys, seemed to know the old paths, carrying with it a whisper of incense and ash. At times when the air was still, one might imagine the city pausing again, listening to its own echo, not out of fear, but recognition. To live here was to share in that quiet remembrance, to accept that the ground beneath your feet had known both abundance and despair. Every spring when the fields outside the walls turned green again, the people held a small service at the cathedral. It was not a grand affair. No banners, no procession, only a gathering at dawn. A monk would read a few lines from the Book of the Counted, his voice low and steady. Then they would stand in silence while the sun rose over the rooftops, washing the stone in pale gold. Some wept quietly, others simply bowed their heads. The city for a brief moment seemed to breathe in unison, its pulse steady, its heart still tender but strong. The years softened the sharp edges of remembrance. New generations brought noise and color back to the streets. Markets grew loud again, ships returned to the harbor, and laughter once more echoed off the walls. Yet even in the height of summer, when the air shimmered with warmth and the sky was clear, there lingered a subtle hush in the city's rhythm, a collective instinct to pause, to listen. It was as if the place itself carried an understanding of fragility, a respect for stillness. Some evenings, when the last light of day slid across the cobblestones, an old man might sit outside his door and tell the story to whoever would listen. He would speak slowly, his gaze far away. There was a time, he'd say, when this whole city was silent, when we counted the living by the sound of their breath. The children, uncertain whether to believe him, would glance toward the darkening streets, and for a moment they would feel it, the weight of the unseen past beneath their feet, the sense that the city was not merely alive, but remembering. The monastery bells rang differently now, not as warnings, but as reminders, a rhythm that marked not endings, but continuance. Each toll stretched out across the rooftops and disappeared into the hills, where the fields swayed with wind and time. The monks still kept the ledgers, adding names each year, but now they wrote them under a new heading, the living. In the end, the city never forgot, though forgetting might have been easier. Memory became its foundation, invisible but solid, like the bedrock beneath the river. It shaped the way people spoke, the way they prayed, the way they built. It lingered in the spaces between things, in the silence after laughter, in the shadows between houses. And when night fell, and the wind drifted once more through the streets, soft, indifferent, endless, it carried with it both the scent of the present and the echo of what had been. The city slept, as it always had, beneath the same stars, over the same bones, its heart still beating quietly beneath centuries of stone. Life went on, humble and unhurried, as memory settled deeper into the earth, where it would wait, patient as dust for the next morning.